You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by KPMG. Making an impact is how KPMG helps make the difference. KPMG applies advanced tools and strategic thinking to convert data into actionable knowledge and deliver value by improving performance through transformation, modernizing processes with technology, harnessing the power of data, navigating complex M&A transactions, and enhancing trust among stakeholders. Go to kpmg.us/advisory to learn more. KPMG. Make the difference.
Shaq here, spinning fast-acting pain relief with Icy Hot. Ice works fast, heat makes it last. Icy Hot, you're so back.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 232, The Battle of Britain Part 7, Battle of Britain Day. This week, a big thank you goes out to Aiden, Cole, and Zach for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. On September 15th, 2024, 84 days to the day after the first Battle of Britain Day, I was on my way to IWM Duxford for the Battle of Britain Day air show. It was an absolutely incredible day, the weather was perfect, and there were so many interesting historical aircraft flying around that day. The sounds of hurricanes and Spitfires in the air, absolutely wonderful. But the perspective of me at an air show is completely different than what it would have been like on September 15th, 1940, the actual Battle of Britain Day. On that day, the Luftwaffe would launch what has come to be seen as the climax of the daytime battles of Britain that had started months earlier. The target of the German raid that day was London, just like it had been over the previous weeks. And once again, RAF Fighter Command would rise to meet them in what would be one of the most costly raids for the Germans over the entire campaign. For the Luftwaffe, rather than a triumphant, climactic clash in the skies above Britain, the day was more of a disappointing end to a long campaign. In what was to be their final effort in some way to save the plans for the invasion, the Luftwaffe put a maximum effort sort of into this day. But even that maximum effort was smaller than some of the most active days earlier in the campaign. The Luftwaffe was simply running out of men, running out of aircraft, and they had run out of time. At the same time, Fighter Command was able to still largely do what it had been doing for weeks by the middle of September, and in roughly the same numbers. This would result in a series of actions on September 15th, during which the entirety of the Luftwaffe campaign of the previous months could be called into question. They simply were not getting the job done. September 15th would start off being a bit hazy. There were a bit of clouds, but it would eventually provide perfect weather for what the Luftwaffe was planning to do on the day. This would be the day for the final grand assault on London, codenamed Valhalla, during which Kesselring's Luftflotte 2 would put a maximum effort raid on London. The plan was to roughly match the same tactics that the Luftwaffe had been using for most of the battle, with a smaller initial raid that was heavily escorted by fighters, and then a larger raid following it up for the main attack. The theory was that RAF fighters would swarm on the first raid, and they would be met by 109s, and then they would be out of position and unable to meet the real strike that followed behind. For this effort, there would be arranged 500 bombers, 100 Bf-110s, and somewhere between 400 and 500 Bf-109s. Their goal was to hit some of the railways around London, with the goal of destroying them to prevent them from being used to move troops southeast of London towards the coast, which was very much an invasion preparation mission. To meet this attack, the 310 fighters available to RAF Fighter Command's 11 Group would be joined by 194 in 12 Group and 126 in 10 Group. While not all of these would be in position to assist in an attack on London, if even half of 12 Group could join the fight over the course of the day, the number of single-engine fighters would be almost even. The first raid would be detected by British radar just a few minutes after 11 a.m. This was made up of Dornier 17s with heavy escort. The Dorniers were an amalgamation of different bomb groups, because by this point in the campaign, many of the bomber groups that had started the campaign were so far below establishment due to combat losses and maintenance issues that they had to be brought together to sort of form actual groups. This did not necessarily impact their performance, but it's noteworthy as a way of understanding the state of the Luftwaffe by the middle of September. All the British knew was that there was a raid, and it was going to be quite large, and so Park's 11 Group began to get squadrons into the air in position to meet them. The first squadrons dispatched were 92 and 72 squadrons from Biggin Hill, with the goal of getting up to 25,000 feet as quickly as possible. Their goal was to launch the first attack against the escorting fighters, distracting them and also bringing them down to a lower altitude during the ensuing dogfight. They would then be followed by 603 Squadron, which would arrive shortly after, and they would be at 20,000 feet in altitude in the hopes that this would position them to reinforce the two squadrons at the right time, because the fight would slowly descend as the dogfighting continued. 6 more squadrons were also put in the air between 11:30 and 11:45, with most of them positioned on the expected path towards London. The ability to orchestrate an interception like this is one of the major problems that the Luftwaffe had faced as they moved their bombing targets further towards London. The RAF often simply had more time, and instead of mad scrambles to get at the bombers that had been required for coastal targets, they could instead plan to kind of peel the layers off of the bomber protection over time. First, they had to deal with the high escorts, which were positioned to dive down on any British fighters that attacked the bombers. Then it was the close escorts that were flying with the bombers themselves. And then finally, the target would be the bombers. If everything went well, all of this would happen even before the Germans reached their targets. Along with the squadrons from 11 Group, 12 Group would be brought into the mix as well, with the goal of bringing in multiple squadrons in one big wing, which would hopefully intercept the bombers from 20,000 feet somewhere around Hornchurch. If the interception worked, they would be perfectly positioned to dive down on the bomber squadrons after their fighter escorts had been distracted, disrupted, and hopefully some of them shot down by the earlier squadrons that had arrived. The actual interception of the raid would actually go mostly as planned. The German bombers were a bit behind schedule, which meant that some of the free-hunting Luftwaffe fighters that had been sent ahead had to return to base before the bombers arrived. But then once the bombers were over Ashford, about 15 kilometers from the coast, they were spotted by 92 Squadron, which went in for the attack, quickly joined by 603 Squadron as well. During the dogfight that would develop, 6 109s would be shot down. About 5 minutes after 92 Squadron first engaged the high fighter escorts, 2 squadrons from Kenley, 253 and 501, often referred to in history as the Kenley Wing, made a direct attack on the bombers and then quickly became engaged with the close bomber escorts. After their attack, 41 and 66 Squadron then arrived, with the 2 squadrons splitting their focus, 41 on the escorts, 66 on the bombers. Just as that attack was complete, 4 more squadrons in 2 different groups arrived from 2 different directions, 257 and 504, and then 605, and then the 1st Canadian Squadron would also arrive, with most of them being engaged by the remaining escorts. During this attack, 4 Hurricanes would be shot down, and it would be around this time, just after noon, that the squadrons from 12 Squadron would then arrive. They arrived at 25,000 feet, above all of the action that was occurring below them. For fighter pilots during the Second World War, this was perfect, and they took time to position so that they came in from behind the German squadrons, and they would have the sun at their backs so that they would be difficult to see. After most of 11 Group's fighters had made their attacks and were on their way back to base, the 3 squadrons of Hurricanes and 2 squadrons of Spitfires from 12 Group would dive onto their targets. Just as this was happening, the German bombers were approaching their bombing points, and they began dropping their ordnance. They were mostly bombing at this point the Clapham Junction Railway, which they would hit and would actually do some damage to. But with the arrival of 12 Group, they were now in trouble. With their fighter protection pushed away by the earlier squadrons and the seeming constant arrival of more and more British fighters, the Dornier bombers would have to fight for their lives all the way back to the Channel. 4 more squadrons from 11 Group joined the 5 from 12 Group in the hunt, and there was a point where there were so many British fighters in the area that they were not able to all attack at the same time. To prevent collisions, they had to kind of queue up and wait their turn to launch their attacks. Eventually, the German bombers would arrive back under the protection of additional 109s that had been sent to escort them back to France, but the damage was already severe. During this action, Fighter Command had lost 13 fighters, a serious number, but it was matched by 12 109s and 6 German bombers, which was around 12% of the entire German raid. Both sides would drastically exaggerate the number of enemies that they shot down, particularly once 12 group squadrons got involved, and there were so many British fighters that a single kill could be counted as many as 9 times by 9 different pilots. But while the specifics were not entirely clear, what was known to the Germans is that they had been met by very large numbers of British fighters. The hope was that by the middle of September, Fighter Command was almost a spent force, that it was down to its last dregs of pilots and aircraft. And yet, instead of appearing that way, against the raid that the Germans had launched, the RAF had mounted a constant stream of attacks from almost the moment that the German bombers had crossed over the coast. It was a constant deluge of fighter squadrons from all different directions, from all different altitudes. It was kind of a nightmare for the German bomber groups. It was also surprising and demoralizing, especially for the bomber crews that had been told to expect much lighter resistance.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Zysol is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Zysol keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all. Take Zysol. At night.
Getting ready to step into your career era? Set yourself apart with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Hone your skills with apps like Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, and more, powered with the latest in creative AI. Students save over 55% so you can build a portfolio you're proud of. Launch your future with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Visit adobe.com/students to learn more.
While the first raid had been costly for the Luftwaffe, it had at least done its job of bringing out as much of the strength of 11 Group as possible. This would have theoretically, at least, allow the second and larger raid of German bombers to reach their targets with far fewer enemy fighters in the air to stop them. The target for the second raid was a series of dockyards in the East End. These docks would be targeted by 114 German bombers from a variety of different bomber groups, and they would be escorted by almost 350 Bf-109s and 20 Bf-110s. There was a problem, though. Because of the very heavy fighter escort for both of the day's raids, many of the 109 groups had to participate in both escort missions. This was within the capacity of the pilots, that wasn't a problem, but there were delays on the ground when it came to getting their planes refueled and rearmed. This cut down on the number of fighters that would be available for the mission, from the planned numbers of greater than 400 down to the 350 that would be available. But more importantly, it also delayed the raid slightly while they waited for more to get ready. This was critical because at the same time that the German fighters were being rearmed and refueled, the exact same thing was happening on the British side. They were also trying to bring the returning fighters of Fighter Command back into readiness as quickly as possible. To add to the Luftwaffe's problems, the British fighters also arrived back at their airfields much sooner than the Germans. They had been in some cases almost on top of them while they were fighting. And if the Germans did not launch their second raid fast enough, the disastrous sort of first raid and the distractions that it had caused would be for nothing because the British would be prepared to meet the second when it arrived. The raid was first detected by British radar at 1:45 p.m., with 3 large groups of aircraft detected, making it clearly a larger raid than what had happened 4 hours before. The plan for this raid was similar to what had been done the first time, with some squadrons meeting the bombers on their way to London, but the majority of the British fighters were scheduled to intercept the raid over London itself or on its way home. This had the obvious downside of making it more likely that the German bombers would actually drop their bombs, but this short-term issue was exchanged for the difficulties faced by the German fighters over London. By the time the German raids reached London, the 109 pilots had to keep a very close eye on their fuel gauges. They only had a very limited amount of fuel that they could burn in dogfights over the British capital if they wanted to make it back to their bases. This was perfect for Fighter Command, because their target was the bombers, not the 109s. And so a 109 that had to turn back around and head back to base because they were out of fuel was just as good, at least for the moment, as one that was shot down. The fact that the target for the raid was almost certainly London also just made things easier for 11 Group headquarters, with Park able to better plan and arrange his squadrons for the intercept. Park would also launch every squadron in 11 Group at the German raid. That's 183 Spitfires and Hurricanes that would eventually come from 11 Group and converge on the German bombers. He would also, of course, request assistance from both 12 and 10 groups. It was truly a maximum effort for Fighter Command. On this occasion, Churchill was actually at 11 Group headquarters to observe what was happening, which resulted in the exchange that has become somewhat famous, with Churchill asking, "What reserves have we got?" when looking at the map plots and the converging forces, and Park answering, "There are none," because he had already ordered every fighter into the air. Park would later say that this answer and the situation as a whole would cause Churchill to look grave, with Churchill sort of addressing this in some of his later writings. Using the typical Churchillian flair, he would say, quote, "What losses we might suffer if our refueling planes were caught on the ground by further raids of 50 plus or 40 plus. The odds were great, our margin small, the stakes infinite." End quote. That last little section there is just the most Churchill that you can possibly Churchill. The odds were great, the margin small, the stakes infinite. While these concerns were legitimate, having a large number of fighters caught on the ground would have been a problem for the RAF if it would have happened. It was a lower risk than perhaps he was insinuating, because that would have went against, the Luftwaffe's recent operating habits of these very large raids all converging on London. Those German bombers that were converging on London were arranged in 3 different groups, each with their own dockyard target in London, and many of them would be intercepted by their first squadrons of British fighters on the outskirts of the city. They then could do nothing other than continue to fly towards their targets as quickly as possible so that they could drop their bombs and turn for home. Most of the bombers would reach a target to drop their bombs on, even though they were not always able to drop them on the docks that they were aiming for. Part of this was due to the general inaccuracy of bombing at high altitude and speed, but one of the groups simply could not see their targets due to clouds, and so they just dropped their bombs on some residential areas of southeast London. All the time that they were looking for and bombing those targets, they were under attack, and the Fighter Command squadrons were just swarming both the bombers and their fighter escorts. It's almost difficult to convey just how fast and chaotic the action was during this raids. Listen to this chaotic lineup. There were 27 Spitfires of 41, 92, and 222 squadrons that attacked some of the high escorts, and then 37 Hurricanes of 213, 607, 501, and 605 squadrons that moved in on one of the bomb groups. At the same time, 249 and 504 squadrons attacked another bomber formation, joined shortly by 46 and 603 squadrons, for a total of 50 Hurricanes and 13 Spitfires among those 4. Elsewhere, 20 Hurricanes of 66 and 72 squadrons were attacking the bombers targeting the Royal Victoria docks. At the same time, 23 Hurricanes of 73, 253, and 303 squadrons were attacking those targeting the Surrey commercial docks. Basically, it was absolute mayhem, with a seemingly constant stream of Fighter Command aircraft attacking either the German fighter or bomber formations, with the 109s often just completely overwhelmed both by numbers and the variety of directions that the Spitfires and Hurricanes were arriving from. And that was even before the 12-group Big Wing arrived with 47 additional fighters that all came in together, although they were at least met by 30 109s, who were in a pretty good position to intercept them. Faced with so many threats, the fuel problems for the German fighters rapidly became acute, and eventually they had no choice but to start heading back home. The German bombers were left alone. And still the RAF fighters kept coming, with 12 Hurricanes and 25 Spitfires of 238 and 602 and 609 squadrons coming into action against the defenseless bombers. All that the Dornier and Heinkel bombers could do was fly as quickly as possible to meet up with their fighter escort that would meet them on the return leg, but making it there would cost them 18 bombers. And then it was over, and the pilots in both the RAF and Luftwaffe began to return to base. On the British side, the ground crews once again frantically worked to turn around squadrons to bring them back into readiness. At 11 Group headquarters at Uxbridge, where the exact status of every squadron was tracked, statuses began to change to ordered to land, then to landed and refueling, and eventually to at readiness. But all of these frantic preparations were not required, because the possible third German air raid never occurred. After the danger seemed to be past, Park would be recorded as telling Churchill, quote, "I'm very glad, sir, you've seen this. Of course, during the last 20 minutes, we were so choked with information that we couldn't handle it. This shows you the limitations of our present resources. They have been strained far beyond their limits today." End quote. The initial story of September 15th, on both sides of the channel, was of wildly exaggerated victory totals, as was the norm for such large aerial engagements. On the German side, the initial estimates based on pilot testimony was that they had destroyed a staggering 79 aircraft. Such a high estimate was already suspect, given the existing understanding of remaining RAF fighter strength, and it was in fact heavily inflated. The real number was around 28 to 31 total British aircraft destroyed, which was around a third of what the Germans officially estimated, which was honestly not their biggest miss of the campaign in terms of estimated versus actual. Instead, it was the turn of the RAF to wildly inflate the total number of losses suffered by the enemy. The actual number of confirmed Luftwaffe losses on the day was 56, with 18 lost during the morning raid, 35 in the afternoon, and the 3 other single bombers lost on reconnaissance flights. These were heavy losses, particularly among the bombers, which made up most of the downed aircraft. But the British claimed that they had shot down a staggering 185 Luftwaffe planes, which was theoretically possible. More than that had participated in the fighting, but was outlandishly high as a number to claim. The challenge was the same as it has always been. When there were a lot of pilots and aircraft involved, there was a heavy tendency for pilots to get confused. It's important to understand that this is not always the pilots, being nefarious or trying to boost their victories artificially. The type of mistakes that could happen were if one pilot hit an enemy aircraft and saw it starting to smoke, and it was clearly no longer combat capable, he might claim that as a kill. But he would frequently lose sight of the enemy and turn his attention somewhere else. They were going hundreds of miles an hour. Well, then another fighter could come in and engage the enemy just to ensure that they were destroyed, and then that pilot would also claim that same kill. Those type of mistakes were greatly amplified when there were so many aircraft all engaging in combat throughout the sky, particularly when large numbers of attacking aircraft made their attacks simultaneously. In retrospect, the greatest issues in British estimates came from 12 Group and the arrival of its big wing of almost 50 aircraft at one time. 11 Group Commander Park was quite critical of the estimates provided by 12 Group, believing that they were clearly boosting their score due to the ongoing debate between Park and 12 Group Commander Lee Mallory about the best way to organize their squadrons to meet the German raids. It was difficult to push back against the inflated estimates, though, if only because everyone in the British leadership wanted a stunning victory. It was really, really good for propaganda and morale, and so the official British figure would stay at 185, even though it was quite difficult to support. And in fact, after the war, the official figure would be drastically revised down to 60, which was much closer to the actual 56. Regardless of their losses, the German bombers did get through to their targets, dropping 110 tons of explosives and 108 incendiary devices, either on their targets or on nearby civilian infrastructure. The damage caused was heavy in those civilian areas, but no real issues were caused for the British war effort, with nothing of real military significance being greatly damaged. Of course, the RAF did not know that the 15th would be one of the last times that there would be mass Luftwaffe activity over Britain, and so they frantically prepared for another round of raids on the 16th. Park would refine his plans to meet another set of raids, much like on the 15th, with decisions made to try and get the Spitfires at a greater altitude to better deal with the highest 109 groups, as well as an engagement plan that would try to do a better job of peeling off those 109s to allow easier access to the bombers for other squadrons. He was also becoming more convinced that the best way to meet the massed German raids, like those on the 15th, was to not try and intercept them on the way in, and instead to let them drop their bombs and then swarm them when the bombers were starting to lose their fighter escort. The Luftwaffe was also not sure that the 15th was the end of their daylight operations, although on the 16th there would be no real raids, mostly due to the fact that there was poor weather. Then on the 17th, the weather was very poor again, and a new forecast made it clear that the bad weather was there to stay for at least a week. It would be these weather reports that put the final nail in the coffin of Sea Lion, because the lengthy delay made it impossible to achieve the invasion before October, which was considered to be simply too late in the year to have any actual success. We will dig into the decision a bit more over the next few episodes, but Hitler would officially postpone the invasion without providing a new date, although it was expected that the operation would be revisited in the spring of 1941. For the Luftwaffe, this delay meant that essentially its Battle of Britain, as defined by its mission since mid-August of destroying RAF Fighter Command, was over. There would still be some fighter action, there would be a few raids for the rest of the month of September, but the large daylight bombing raids with the purpose of enabling Operation Sea Lion were over. For the last 2 weeks of September, there would be several more smaller raids, but nothing like what had happened on the 15th. The exact dates on the Battle of Britain are kind of all over the place, and it depends on who you're reading and who you're paying attention to. But if we look at the period of time when the Germans were preparing for an invasion, they were preparing for Operation Sea Lion, which all date from July 10th to September 15th, you see that the Luftwaffe had lost 1,155 aircraft, and the RAF had lost 1,134. The larger number of Luftwaffe losses included a large percentage of the committed bomber groups, which was problematic for future bombing operations. A large issue for the Luftwaffe was the fact that almost every single one of the pilots and aircrew from those aircraft were lost, either killed or having been taken prisoner in Britain. For a military service that would soon be trying to find every possible trained pilot to meet the growing requirements of a two-front war, such losses were problematic. But those issues were still in the future as the sun set on September 15th, Battle of Britain Day, because the Battle of Britain was about to change, and in fact the Blitz was about to begin.